Now, advance to slide 1, please. We have the title slide for the next session. And now Steve Shinn has a group of folks he's going to bring in. Steve, can you post them down? So while they're coming, I'm going to ramble over that as I'm going to do. Mount Palomar. Who remembers Mount Palomar? When I was a kid, Mount Palomar was a big deal. First time I saw anything about Mount Palomar was in a Superman comic book. And since then, it's become a fixture in comic books, in amazing stories, in Scientific America, all over the place. It was a fixture. You go to a movie on sci-fi or something like that, and half the time you would have Mount Palomar as a background for a science fiction movie. So we're going to talk about great observatories. I don't think they're going to talk about Mount Palomar. I hope not. Anyway. So this is Steve Shinn. He's a moderator. He is the Deputy Chief Financial Officer of NASA. No, of NASA, not of Goddard, of NASA. Thank you, Steve. And let's go ahead with the panel.
Are we on? There we go. Good afternoon. Yes, I'm Steve Shinn. I'm the agency Deputy Chief Financial Officer. Although I love me some Goddard. I was at Goddard for about a decade. So obviously, this is like home. It's like coming home back to this event. I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves. I'll just mention briefly that part of this panel, I'll give one warning up front. It's called the Great Observatories. We're building the next one. We're going to a little bit use the term observatories and flagships interchangeably, although they are not, only from the perspective as we're talking about anything that's a large mission that starts to have different considerations than others. But we, of course, we will talk about that specific topic as well. So with that, we have no microphones. We are on fire. All right, so with that, why don't we start with Patty and just a brief introduction, name, and where you work.
Hi, my name is Patty Boyd. I work at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center. I'm the chief of the Exoplanets and Stellar Astrophysics Lab and have been involved in several mission teams, including the Hubble Space Telescope a couple times in 2 different decades. I'm currently on details at NASA headquarters, initiating the S&D Bridge program that Paul Hartz mentioned earlier.
I'm John Arenberg. I'm the Chief Mission Architect for Science and Robotic Exploration at Northrop Grumman, and I've spent most of my 33 years at the company working on or chasing or building or designing large astrophysics missions, Chandra, James Webb, and the Decadal Survey missions.
Okay, I'm Alison, and I'm the Director of Space Science and Instrumentation at Lockheed Martin's Advanced Technology Center. And I spent the better part of my 23 years at Lockheed working on the NIRCam instrument for James Webb. Since we shipped that off to Goddard several years ago, I've transitioned to doing technology development and been working with the STDTs on several of the great observatory potential missions as proposed to the Astro 2020 and developing technologies for those.
All right, thank you. So our fourth panelist was Francesco Bordi. He's still alive, he's just ill right now, so he's not with us. So I will channel my inner Francesco as we go on. In terms of an opening, I'll mention one thing just to kind of get us started, that obviously this is a favorable crowd, hometown crowd here. The importance or the relative import of building those great flagships or observatories is pretty well documented, whether it's in the National Academy's reports or even NASA's own studies or external. And I'll cite a few of them to sort of lay that as a baseline. You can capture science data that really is not otherwise available at a different mission class. It's answering some of those most compelling scientific discussions or questions that are facing us in many fields. It's answering some of those most compelling questions of humanity, some of which were just mentioned a few moments ago. And of course, everything from supporting the nation, the world, the workforce, et cetera, and providing leadership in science and knowledge throughout the world. And of course, it is an enormous place where we can parlay into international discussions or international partnerships as well. Just for fun, only because I also love me some Hubble. You know, in the course of Hubble's existence, there's been more than like 16,000 papers published from Hubble data, still like 800 a year. So think about the amount of scientific knowledge that has been generated by that one observatory. It's truly remarkable. So with that, Francesco and I actually a couple of years ago co-authored a paper on developing and implementing flagship missions. Francesco and Dr. Scalise are way classier than me, as you probably have already gathered. I wanted to call it flagships are freaking hard, but they gave us some name like, imperatives for consideration for implementing flagship missions in the future, blah, blah, blah. But they are freaking hard. And to that end, technology development, risk management, moving into the Class A status that comes with it, is probably some of those areas that makes it so hard. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alison first and just basically say, requirements, technical maturity, all those things, they impact how much we drive cost and schedule of these missions because of that. So, how can we do this? How do we operate at that risk level while also being cognizant of the posture for the overall cost and schedule of the mission?
Okay, so there's probably two parts there, one in the technology development and then one in the risk reduction. So the technology development needs to go hand in hand and earlier than phase A. I'm not going to say anything that people haven't already heard before or that our lessons learned from Webb haven't told us, that we really need to develop that technology early in order to reduce the risk of the program. And I would also encourage us to think about not just, when JWC was started, there were 10 risks that were kind of identified as these are the risks that we need to develop in order to buy down that. And it was kind of assumed, okay, the instruments are easy compared to that. And there was no risk associated with NIRCam per se. There was for the microshutters, and that's true, that was a very difficult thing. But with NIRCam, it was assumed, okay, we're just putting optics in, it's not that hard. But then if you look at the requirement on 69 nanometers first place in the field, and it had to be stable through cryo, and it had to be aligned at room temperature, had to come into alignment cryo, and suddenly you put all of those things together in an architecture, and you do need technology development. You can't mount single crystal optics the way you did before and expect that they're going to work and stay stable. So we really need to think about the integrated architecture when we think about risks. And when we take requirements to a new level and add on 2 or 3 other requirements together, you suddenly have a new technology that you need to develop that you didn't think you did before. So that was one area of risk. And then when we get into building risk, we have these Class A flagship missions, and yes, they cannot fail. We've got to make sure that they work right. But I think we need to also think about right-sizing our risk. The way we executed, and John can speak for how he did it at Northrop, but the way it was executed with NIRCam was that it was almost like considered a blank check. If it's risk reduction, we have to do it. Let's add on a few more people to oversight. And then we'll add on a few more to look at those people on oversight. And pretty soon you've got 8 people watching one person torque a bolt. And you don't have 8 people watching that person torque a bolt. You have 7 people talking about the Giants game and 1 person torquing a bolt. So we need to right size that risk because it's not an open checkbook, and you end up doing more detriment than more harm than good in some cases of that. So we really need to think about that and be able to say, no, that's not helping our risk posture. So maybe controversial statements here.
John, did you want to add something?
So I'll add I'll go in a different direction. I agree with 99.44% of what Alison said, because we can't.
That's the recipe for ivory soap.
I know, that's why I picked it. I think one other thing that goes with risk and challenge of these large strategic missions, which makes it fundamentally different than every other mission class, and even the probes, is those are PI led. There's one brain, there's one idea at the head of it. And we've talked about building teams and securing funding and making everything work. When you have a large strategic mission, a flagship, one of its fundamental goals is being the community's big science, broad spectrum, everybody in the tent. And that brings a whole set of other requirements and other risks in dimensions you can't put on a risk chart. You need to keep that scientist happy, and that scientist happy, and that scientist happy, and the CFO happy, and the program manager happy. And so that is another consideration that gives you an additional dimension of risk. I do agree that it needs to be managed more organically as part of the engineering process. We have these, we all have these risk boards and our risk cubes and all of that formalism, but ultimately it's about doing good engineering, it's about doing the best thing for the program. Earlier panels talked about communication, and using performance budgets to manage cost and risk. I think one of the things, and certainly I've written about it and trying to push it forward, is the explicit inclusion of cost and schedule as requirements to help manage where the resources need to go. Because sometimes risk gets managed by who yells loudest in the risk board. So this is ultimately a people business, and sometimes it comes down to personalities. And sometimes somebody with a small problem is either a big hulking individual or highly influential or just loud, or the boss's favorite or whatever it happens to be. And so we do need increased quantitative methods to do the management of these missions.
That's a great point. I might want to pivot back to readiness levels in a few moments, but just because the two responses, by the way, you get to experience my ADD on just go all over the place, from small picture, big picture, all over. I want to drive because we talked about the teams. It is in some ways fundamentally different because of the size of the teams as well as the duration with which these missions take to get to development. So I'll go to Patty on this one first. Well, I'll say two things. One, the length of it, just in general, of something like a web, the team had been together for so long and of course changing. So you're looking at a culture that needs to work for a long time in some level of harmony, if not just working together to achieve a common goal. How do you see that fitting with overall NASA's culture, our values, the way we interact both in a badgeless society, but also, as been alluded to, sometimes it's not as badgeless as we want it to be. So I'll let you take it first.
Thanks, Steve. So I think we're at such an exciting time and a time of great opportunity here where we're talking about the next great flagship, which is going to take decades to build and to implement, and has this overarching science goal that Sean was talking about earlier of being able to detect gases in an Earth-like planet, Earth-sized planet around a sun-like star. That's such an exciting, driving question that it speaks to everyone. And we're doing that on the moment where we're watching the GSFC team come together with that telescope finally in space, starting with a solar array deploying in front of all of our eyes and ending just less than a week ago with this, a mirror that's going to perform better than the best estimates. So I think it's a great point for us to be at. We're also coming to it after 2 years where we've been almost completely virtual. Our world has changed and we're starting to come together. We're coming together again in person, maybe for the first time. What are the opportunities here? I think we have to be very aware that pandemic reality that we're in has hit the workforce in a very differentiated way. In particular, there's a National Academies workshop happening today and tomorrow about the impacts of COVID on women in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So there's been this gradient impact. So we're at this moment where we can really look at all of these processes. You're talking about what are we learning about the risk process, which we have a language to talk about that. Is this a moment where we can stop and look at, what are some of our processes that are 20, 30 years old, 40 years old maybe, that we need to tweak for the new reality? I think we can go have that conversation in a way that gets us to a place that is, comfortable and aggressive as far as where we want to go scientifically and technically for our whole workforce, and to fold in the other NASA values as well. They're all part of mission success, And certainly scientific excellence and technical excellence is a part of that mission success puzzle that we know how to speak about very well.
So let's pull on that thread for either Alison or John. So from the perspective, as Patty just mentioned, the culture and the way we interact will be different for the next one. How do you see that working either the same or in a different manner? Arm wrestling.
I was gonna say rock, paper, scissors, but, well, I think for the next one, there was, if we look at the last one, industry was involved, but there was a big, heavy competition at the beginning, and, time one, we lost, we got an instrument, good, but there wasn't as much, collaboration as I think there could be in the next one. And I think that we could bring together the best, John and I, and he's gonna, maybe hit me on this one, there are things that we may be better than he is at, and there are things that you're better than we are at. And if we could bring together, and this next flagship's going to be, hopefully, the greatest thing of the rest of our, decades and careers, and we're gonna need to bring the best of the US, and the best of international partners. We can't be so siloed and compartmentalized, so that we're gonna have to figure out how to do this truly badgeless team where you're bringing the best talents from each group together. And programmatically, that's gonna be a challenge, because how do we compete to get on that team? But we need to do so very early, I think, and then let us all work together.
Agree, because we've discussed this. I'm gonna split the difference between my two panelists, and I want to talk about cultures of the teams. So having worked on 2 flagships for decades, plural, the way teams interact, Chandra was largely a program before email. We physically FedEx documents, attaching a document to an email was an adventure in computer science and hope, right? And somebody had an email program that formatted with tabs on the left, you couldn't decode the program. I remember this vividly. We had lots of face-to-face meetings, monthly meetings where everybody got on an airplane, went to one place. James Webb was much less face-to-face meetings, although we did a lot of travel and a lot of meetings. Who knows what the future, hopefully it's not as virtual. I think it's very important to see the nonverbal cues of your teammates when you get up and say, the team's gonna go this way, and everybody's body language says, no, John, you're nuts. I want whatever you're drinking, because that ain't gonna work. It doesn't come over on a Zoom call, even when you're working with people that you worked with for 30 years. So I do think that is a challenge to manage, because everybody's gonna expect to stay home and do it that way, and people are gonna not price in travel in the project budgets, and that's a tragic mistake. On the other hand, once you form that badgeless team, like the gender team, like the web team, you can walk through walls. Absolutely critical to doing these amazingly hard things. If you look at any of the lessons learned papers that we've written from Chandra, the first thing at the top was team. Consistency of science, and the requirements was good, the money was nice, team was first. It's a 30-year-old team, we're still close, we still spend lots of time, we still write papers together. We're looking forward to the next mission. That's a very important thing, but it's engendered by person-to-person communication, and that's one trend I'm not real thrilled about. I like to get everybody in the room. But we'll see what happens with the next flagship. But again, get that team in the room, form it early, make it completely broad and inclusive, and get the best athletes, if you will, on the team. And if you thought that picture was amazing, wait and you see what's going to happen in 2 decades.
So following on that, obviously, I care deeply about money, personally and professionally. So there's nothing Alison cares about more than humanity. She told me that earlier. So for her, it's about the good of the world. However, there's someone in her company that does care about revenue and making sure, another little secret is when you win one of these things, that company, they've already booked that revenue. Now it's like, what are you going to win for me next? So I want to pose the same question. And again, obviously, John and Alison are on the panel, so we make you answer real time in front of 150 of your closest friends. There are considerations for intellectual property, how you work both batchlessly, but also work for an organization who's developing you, paying you, training you, all those things to make sure that that organization stays financially viable. So how do you have, obviously we do pretty well, you know, as an agency, as a community, but how do we sort of foster, because it's been said several times already, for the next one, we've got to do even more to operate in that sort of batchless team environment. So what are some thoughts on things we can do the same or differently to make that happen? And I can go to either one of you first, so I just tease Alison, so.
Sure, I'll go first. I'll try and go first this time. This is a challenge to put your organization's best foot forward, not give anything up, but also not hurt the program. So during the decadal studies, we all in industry had small study contracts. We basically talked amongst ourselves and we said, we're not going to put any proprietary information in anything we contribute to those studies. As public domain can be published. And so I'm not the organizational conflict lawyer or the IP lawyer, but I believe by example, such things can be managed and agreed upon equitably. And I believe especially in the early stages here where we're talking about very broad architecture and mission concepts, what science to put on, what to come off, what's the best way to achieve these missions. I still think it's very early in the architecture stage, and it's an interesting question for later when you have to pick teams and you have to write proposals and compete and do all that, and that's when you bring out the, my secret sauce is as good or more tasty than Alison's, and all of those sorts of things. But there's a time for that. Right now, the types of requirements that we're talking about for this future flagship, 3 orders of magnitude more stable. You heard earlier, 69 nanometers. The next mission won't be talking in nanometers, we'll be talking in picometers. That's a millionth of a micron. Your hair, should you be fortunate enough to have any, is approximately 70 microns, 50 to 70 microns across. So take that, divide that by 1,000. That's 50 times more than the budget and numbers we're going to be talking about. It will be hard in ways we cannot currently imagine. So it will take truly the best of us across the community to achieve it. I believe it's fundamentally possible. The real question is it possible within the budget and the schedule that Steve is going to give us? That's the real question. Almost anything is achievable with infinite resources. We're all creative, we're all hardworking. It's can you do it in a finite amount of time for a finite amount of money? That's the truly hard part. That takes a team. And there will be times when we can share, and there will be times when we have to compete. And we just have to not let I don't know how to answer that question that's going to come up in 2042 today stop us from making progress.
Yes, there are people at my company that care a lot about money, and I guess I do too. Humanities first, but science actually first. So, but then how do we compete and yet work together? That's a really tough question. But it uses an exemplar of what we've been doing in the last few years in the system level segmented telescope design work. This is a technology development area to try to get at that 10 picometer stability, that if it doesn't make you just squirm in your seat, then you don't understand what a picometer is. It's awfully small and that's awfully stable, but it's going to take a lot of technologies to go together to do that. So on these teams, there are 2 teams working on this, and we're actually working together. And it's actually working really well. Northrop Grumman is working with Ball and L3 Harris and the Space Telescope Science Institute, confirmed, on the Ultra team. And then Lockheed's leading the TechMass, Technology Maturation for Astrophysics Space Telescopes team. And L3 Harris is on both teams. We have a university partner with us as well. And one of the things that we're working on together is integrated modeling. How do we make a simulation of this telescope and predict performance? We could talk for a long time about integrated modeling. I'm sure we're probably going to get back to that. But this is one area in which we are sharing models back and forth. We're each working on different portions of it. And the conclusion is much bigger and broader and more important than either one of our independent models. And I think we need to continue that kind of work.
So Patty, you heard them, they are dying to collaborate in every possible way, so then how do we as, good government stewards, help everyone collaborate in a manner that achieves these results?
So I think that's one of the key questions in all different cultures that come together here for great observatories, right, for the next flagship. It's going to be a group effort that is achieved by folks at industry, folks at NASA centers, and folks at universities, and those are all very different cultures, and they all treat competition differently. It's important in all places, but it's, it's different compared to collaboration, I think, and those are two that are very important also. Collaboration is very important in all three different cultures, but how do we weigh that tension between cooperation and competition, either within those three cultures and across them? I certainly think that the place to start is with a conversation, right? I would worry that if NASA were to try to prescribe something ahead of time, that could result in the wrong prescription. There's a tremendous amount of wisdom in all three of these cultures. We have done great observatories in the past. We're all excited to do the next one. It really is transformational science that we're talking about. So I would think that NASA should begin by reaching out for a conversation about how to engender more competition so that we are, and more equitable and collaborative competition. Co-opetition, it's a word I heard last week at a last meeting. How do we strike that balance so that communication is working well, that we're not doing the same work twice at different places, but that we keep those driving overarching goals, which are so visionary as our common pathway forward.
I'm going to go one more on that, because Patty brought up a great point. So they last a long time, right? So you start off as a young scientist on one, you may be an old scientist by the time it actually happens. So with that, how do we sort of foster that development of the team and sort of encourage the next generation to stay with these activities? I'll start with Patty.
So I'm glad to see that the State of the Profession panel on the decadal has been mentioned a few times. Jane and I were both on that panel. It was such a wonderful panel to be a part of. Very grateful to have been part of that. Grateful to the steering committee of the decadal survey for working with our panel so closely along the way, writing a really compelling chapter 3 and including our full appendix. This is the first decadal since the 60s, if you want to go as far back as what could be considered a decadal, that actually had a State of the Profession panel that was chartered with making actionable recommendations. So that is a change from the last several decades. And those recommendations are threaded through the report, including how we do achieve these next generation flagships. So I think that each of us is somewhere on this world line in our careers. We're at a position, depending on where you're in our careers, of making choices and making decisions. Whether you're deciding who your study partner is going to be, who your intern is going to be next summer, who's going to be on your team, who's going to be on your proposal. Those are all really important decisions for the people on your team. And so we each have an opportunity, depending on where we are and how much leadership authority we have, to look at our processes, to ask the questions of who are we encouraging to be on our teams, who do we need on our teams and why? When we make those decisions, who are we leaving out, maybe unintentionally, and how do we be more inclusive? So we've heard some discussion about outreach to students. We've heard some discussion about bridge programs to minority serving institutions and HBCUs. At the same time, we have to look inward. inclusion is not about just diversifying the demographics of the people on your team. It's about making sure that the people on your team actually have the ability, the comfort level, the authority to make suggestions, to point out a risk that you may not be aware of. You want to make sure that you're creating an environment where everybody does feel comfortable to bring a risk to you, and that you've put together a team where that type of environment can be achieved. So I think we do have a great opportunity here. One of the things I think is most amazing is to watch the early career people across the profession, whether it's scientists or technicians or engineers, really coming together ahead of the official word and pulling together science cases. We're seeing it on the probes already. One of the far infrared probes, there are scientists getting together driven by the early career people saying, let's work together as a community. What are the most exciting driving questions for this? And I hope that we could just take that as a lesson across the board for a very diverse community already for the future going in that direction.
So John, I'm going to ask you a follow-up to that. One is obviously just coming off a big success. So yeah, there's a paradigm, so there's called the Noah's Ark paradigm. Have you achieved equity when you have two of everything? And the answer is no. So, what were some of your experiences or things you saw that worked either, going back to Chandra more recently with web, that worked well to actually foster that, that developmental spirit so that folks felt comfortable coming forward with either solutions or questions?
So let's see, part of my job, and Charlie, who has my job currently as a design leader or technology leader, is to make an environment where it's safe for people to come up and ask questions. The thing that kept me up at night, especially during the design phase, was missing a problem that could have been easily addressed and not finding it either until later in the mission or after launch, the prophetic failure of imagination. And that propelled me to think across disciplines and designs, and the best way you multiply your brain power is by inviting everybody else to think about that if they have a concern. And so I had office hours as chief engineer, and I just let people come in, and maybe 30 or 40 people came in over a couple of years, and some of the problems weren't very real, and some of them were just wrong. But in a couple of cases, there was something that we really hadn't thought about, and we were able to take relatively simple action and take care of it. And the one thing I said is, whatever happens in my office stays in my office, and I would be the one to raise these, even if they were crazy or a little outlandish, and protect the people that came to me so that they felt safe doing it. And that enabled the people that were close to the hardware to do that. And there was one case where I had to pull the stop chain to stop things going because they were going in the wrong direction. It was not very popular. I would do it again. It was the right thing for the hardware to do. And I think it set an example for the younger engineers, and it's always the right thing to do, the right thing for the hardware. And that encourages people to stay in the area and develop their careers and be ready to perform on the next mission.
Yeah, sure. I'll talk about how we're developing the next generation and transferring, that knowledge that we may have gained as I'm starting to get toward the older end of my career, and looking at those folks that are coming in and truly trying to recruit a diverse group, and then obviously make them feel, it seems obvious to me because I came into a field that didn't feel very inclusive about 30 years ago, and use my own lessons in how to make it a lot more inclusive now, to include those people. And then also find an opportunity where you can let them fail. As we're doing early technology developments, it's a great opportunity. There's not a lot of risk on the line. Pairing up a couple of subject matter experts with a group of young early career enthusiastic engineers and let them get their hands on hardware early. Without the process of a Class A mission. CubeSats are excellent demonstrations of both technology demonstration and learning opportunities. So trying to pair up, and it has to be deliberate. We really need to deliberately work on knowledge transfer and identify critical skills that we need to bring our diverse young people up through and make sure that they're experiencing that and having the opportunity to really think for themselves and not second guess them all the time.
Yeah, so I'll probably the last sort of generic topic, and I will leave a little bit of time for some audience questions, although this is so fun, I never get a microphone to ask other people questions, so. I want to go back to that for a moment, just talk about technology development. That was a great example of finding small sort of actionable things that can be done to give people a chance to develop. You know, one of the basic tenets, and I know I'm painting a broad stroke here, of a typical complicated small or medium mission is it's got a couple of new developments that maybe have never been done before. And once you conquer those, you generally control cost and schedule. When you're talking about either the next great observatory or a flagship, you're talking about any number of developments that need to go far beyond what a typical mission is. And spoiler alert, that's what causes a lot of the cost and schedule, because there's just so many. So with that, are there any early architecture decisions or approaches, off-ramps, on-ramps, that could make them so we get a little more sustainability to that technology readiness? John has his hand up first. We need buzzers.
Buzzers like Jeopardy. I take a little bit of issue with the premise of your question, and then I'll go ahead and try to answer.
You're cut off.
Yeah. In order for a science mission to be at all interesting and therefore funded, it has to be new in some way. So all of these missions, even the small PI-led, have some level of new in them, right? The difference is the flagship has new, it has a different management structure, and it has a different set of science customers. And so you have that complication in space. So the problem is faced at all levels, and so the smaller missions are excellent training grounds for the higher missions. One idea that I have been propagating and sharing with anybody who'll listen and some that won't is a lesson that we had on Chandra. Chandra started out as a Hubble-like serviceable mission with multiple generations of instruments. Once we got the technology developed, which wasn't quite developed, we had a small technology failure later, that's another story. The government said, we don't have the full amount of money. We've got this much money, and depending on whose contract and how you count it up, it's a different number, but it was substantially less. The question was, can you take those mirrors that we're already building and build some kind of mission around it for the money and the time available? And the team took up the challenge, and we spent basically the first year of the mission after the technology test re-architecting, essentially doing 20 or 25 little phase A studies. And what emerged out of it was the final architecture that was built. So my lesson is not to make those decisions, but to do the studies, the planning, right? Live the adage from Eisenhower that the plans are worthless, planning is invaluable. And really understanding the performance, cost, and schedule space so that when the final decision is made that we're ready to go with mission X, we can go ahead and move ahead, really understanding the interplay between the science, the hardware, the people, the cost, and the money, and that will lead to a higher probability of success and less surprise, because you've really looked under all the rocks and around all the trees and know where to avoid the trolls and the ogres that live under these bridges that sometimes we don't get to look under when we have to cross them. So being flexible and having lots of ways to be successful, as opposed to picking a path today when we don't really know what the problems will be in the future.
I stopped listening after you said you didn't agree with me, but I know it's a good point. Alison?
Okay, so I'm gonna bring it back to the difference between Chandra and Webb being from you didn't even have email to we have email to we make independent models of Webb where we've got a telescope over here and an instrument over here. We've got a thermal model, and we have a structural model, and we think we've done really well when we can combine thermal and structural and optical together, yay. And we didn't include instrument performance, and we didn't include science performance, and we didn't include dynamic stability and control architectures and everything. And we've got a real opportunity here with this next one, because we have advanced this study of digital twin and integrated modeling quite a bit. We still have a long way to go, but that holy grail of being able to completely model an entire system of a flagship and start with how does this hinge joint stiffness affect science yield on exoplanets? We're getting there. We're close. We see a path to get there. I'll put it that way. We're not there yet, but I think we can, and that will help us identify where are the real drivers in the technology development by being able to do that and iterate very quickly.
I'll say real quick, agree 150% with everything Alison said. Everything on that one, can't lose them all, right? One of the things that we can do different is invest in critical experiments to validate those models early. And maybe it won't be the flight configuration. We had a number of key critical tests to validate conducted parasitics on Webb, the Core 1, and then when it was redesigned, we had to do it again, Core 2. Absolutely invaluable. And again, another idea, if we have a missions of a class of ships that could then reuse that modeling so that we then don't have to re-spend that effort. Now you're talking about making more observatories faster for less money, more science, sooner, better. So I think there are a lot of opportunities to do that.
So you're talking well beyond astrophysics now, is that correct? If you take that concept of the integrated modeling, does that apply to, flagship type missions that are not necessarily focused on astrophysics, and does it apply to different size scales as well? So you see like broader implications for proposals in general?
Yes.
So we have, I do not want to cut into Kate's time. She's awesome. They're all warmed up for you, Kate. But we have time for one or two questions.
Okay, first we need to know, do we have any questions from online? Sorry from a minute ago. Maybe not. Okay, right over here. You were waving, jumping up and down. Microphone too.
All right, so throughout this afternoon, there's been a lot of talk about diversity and talent, and it's good to realize that talent doesn't grow on trees, right? It's hard to find. And so I wanted to insert some statistics just to wake up to the fact that some of these talents are defined. Imagine if the University of Maryland system within the last 5 years lost 42% of its budget. That's what's happening right now with Hispanic serving institutions. The last 5 years, we cannot assume that we're going to be able to open up a good effort to welcome these communities into our agencies and to our industries. They're not going to be there because their institutions are losing money by the millions. So how do we, for those who have that discretionary leadership authority, graduate into a level where you're talking about advocating for these underserved communities without taking them for granted? And Steve, I'm pretty sure you know which university organization I'm talking about.
Steve, can you answer that question, please? Take the first part.
I'll put on my agency hat just to say that is an imperative we're looking at the highest levels for exactly that reason. What does it mean to advocate and partner with some of these universities, minority serving institutions, and also I add different ones, right? Not just the 3 or 5 that have historically been performers. How do you go out and do outreach to additional organizations, as Juan was mentioning, that are, that maybe you're not getting the level of advocacy that's occurring right now. So I think you'll see a lot on that coming in the future, including Charlotte Lambert at the agency level is specifically addressing that topic. So I'm hopeful, if nothing else, but I do think it is widely recognized within this administration. That's an area where we need to advocate more for.
All right, Abigail, do we have any questions online? All right, now. All right, next question. Oh, okay.
Thanks for all the great lessons learned. This is one that I thought of when you were talking about the risk reduction and how that can balloon. So a lot of the engineers and management from James Webb are rolling over to Grumman. So that gives a really good opportunity to capitalize on the lessons learned because those things will have experienced it. But on the flip side, you also risk falling into old habits and carrying over to old culture. So for example, with the risk reduction, when things get more rushed, like an integration and test, the easiest path and the quickest path sometimes is what did we do on the last Class A mission? So let's do that here. So do you have any strategies for yourself and tips for people under you on how to interrupt those tendencies to just continue on what's been tried and true on the last mission?
Okay. Well, we won't have that problem on Roman, I'll just tell you that. Neither will he. But if we jump forward to the next mission, and there's a lot of us that think, okay, what went well on the last mission, we need to carry through. But I don't think John or I want to carry through things that didn't go well on Webb, even though we were successful in the end. So I think that almost we're more in a position, if we have that experience, to say, oh, no, that was really not a good thing on Webb. Let's change it on the next mission. So I think if it goes well, let's carry it over. And if it doesn't, you've got those lessons learned and the scars to prove it. So
Yeah, I'll try to be real quick. Typically, things that go on the risk register were contingency or issues that no one thought of in design. Right? So it's like, ooh, I forgot the telescope. We have to make sure that the telescope is aligned. Let me put a risk in there. That's a joke, by the way. And so I think a more complete understanding of the design, the sensitivities, puts those things into planning. I think the one habit that we need to not fall into is people underestimate the value of prototypes, early experiments, pathfinders, environmental development units. We made great use of them on Chandra. A lot of the folks, in fact, almost everybody that built the Webb telescope worked on the Chandra telescope, took that idea in spades. It was not as uniform throughout the rest of the program, but taking that lesson learned and pushing it forward will reduce a lot of those risks, particularly in handling, understanding the real life. So I think it's even better planning will reduce the things that go on the risk register. And we also need to use it for real risks and not a parking lot for things that weren't properly funded. So again, I think it's a management tool, and we have to be good learning engineers so that we don't fall into the habits of the past and actually employ the lessons learned. And I don't know how you legislate that, you just have to have the right folks.
So one last question. What is Roman?
So Roman is the Nancy Grace Roman Space Telescope. That's the next flagship under development down the street at Goddard. Late 20s.
2027. It's about 100 times wider field than the deep field from Hubble Space Telescope. So you'll often hear the phrase that it's 100 times Hubble.
Good, thank you.
Sure.
Steve, this has been great. And it's another example of having a good panel without charts. Thank you very much.